There is a photograph from the summit of Mount Everest, taken on the afternoon of May 19th, 2012. In it, a woman is holding a Canadian flag. She's smiling. She is at 29,032 feet, the highest point on Earth. She has been climbing for more than 16 hours. She does not know yet what the next few hours will cost her. Or maybe she does. Somewhere beneath the hypoxia and the exhaustion and the weight of everything she came here to prove, and has decided that it doesn't matter. Her name was Shreya Shah Chlorfine. She was 33 years old. She was born in Nepal, raised in India, and had spent her adult life in Canada, where she trained for years for this single moment. The story she had told publicly, the immigrant woman who would stand on top of the world, who would plant the Canadian flag at the highest point on Earth, had gathered sponsors, media coverage, a public following. By the time she reached base camp in the spring of 2012, the summit was no longer only a personal goal. It was a public commitment, the kind that is very hard to walk back from, even when the mountain is telling you to walk back. She reached the summit at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. That time matters more than almost anything else in this story. In the mountaineering community, there is an informal rule, sometimes called the turnaround time, that says a climber who has not reached the summit by a certain hour, typically between noon and 2 p.m., depending on route and conditions, should descend regardless of how close they are. The reasoning is simple. The descent takes as long as the ascent. Every hour spent above the death zone is an hour the body is running out of oxygen, warmth, and the cognitive capacity to make decisions. A summit reached at 2:30 p.m. means a descent that runs well into the night, in temperatures that kill exposed skin in minutes, on terrain that requires every functioning neuron a climber has left. Shreya Shah Chlorfine reached the summit at 2:30. She took her photographs. She smiled at the camera. She began her descent. She died on the mountain that night, less than 300 meters below the top. What happened between the summit photograph and the moment she stopped moving is not a simple story of personal failure. It is the story of a system, the commercial Everest industry, the operators who sell dreams, the guides asked to manage the unmanageable, and the Sherpas who are left holding the consequences when everything goes wrong. It is a story about what happens when the gap between what you paid for and what the mountain requires becomes too wide to survive. It would be easy and wrong to tell this story by reducing Shreya Shah Chlorfine to her death. She was a serious person who took her ambition seriously. She had not stumbled into Everest on a whim. She had spent years preparing, had done significant trekking and climbing at altitude, and had invested substantial time, money, and physical effort into the goal. She was not the caricature that some post-incident coverage made her, the naive dreamer who had no idea what she was getting into. She had an idea. The idea was incomplete, and the incompleteness was fatal, but it was not nothing. She was also navigating pressures that are easy to underestimate from the outside. The story she had told publicly had taken on a life of its own before she left for base camp. Sponsors had contributed. Media coverage had followed her preparation. And she had attempted Everest once before, in 2011, and had been turned back by conditions on the upper mountain. That turnaround had cost her. Not only financially, though it had cost her that too, but in the currency of public narrative. The story of the woman who almost made it is harder to tell than the story of the woman who did. When she returned in 2012, she was not returning with fresh ambition. She was returning with the weight of the previous attempt, the public commitment, the sponsors, and the specific knowledge of what it felt like to be turned back once already. None of that excuses the decisions that were made on May 19th. But all of it is necessary to understand how those decisions happened. Shreya Shah Chlorfine was guided by an operator called Utmost Adventure Trekking, a Nepali company that offered Everest expeditions at the lower end of the commercial market. The price she paid, reported as somewhere between $8,000 and $15,000, far below the $45,000 to $65,000 charged by established Western operators, reflected a significant reduction in the level of support, guidance, and oversight that came with the expedition. At that price point, the infrastructure that more expensive operators provide is standard, experienced Western guides, high Sherpa-to-client ratios, rigorous pre-expedition screening, active management on summit day, was either reduced or absent. This is not an accusation specific to Utmost Adventure Trekking. It is a description of how the lower end of the commercial Everest market operates. The mountain is expensive regardless of who is running your expedition. The permit alone costs $11,000 per person, and the base camp logistics, oxygen, and Sherpa support add thousands more. An operator offering an Everest expedition for $10,000 is, mathematically, running on margins that make comprehensive support impossible. Something gets cut. Usually, what gets cut is the layer of experienced oversight that catches problems before they become fatal. The question of what Shreya was told, about what her preparation level meant for her actual chances, about what turnaround times implied for the descent, about what a 2:30 p.m. summit with limited oxygen remaining actually cost, is a question that was never fully answered in the investigations that followed her death. What is clear is that the system around her on summit day did not stop her from continuing upward past the point where a more experienced guide or a more expensive operation might have intervened. Experienced Everest operators describe a specific challenge that every guide on the mountain faces: the client who will not turn around. The pressure created by a client's investment, years of preparation and public commitment, the emotional and financial weight of the decision to descend, can be nearly impossible to overcome through persuasion alone. The client wants the summit. The client has wanted the summit for years. The guide is telling them to descend, and the client is not descending. At the lower end of the market, that challenge is compounded by the fact that the guide's authority is weaker when the contractual relationship is thinner. A $65,000 client has signed detailed agreements with operators who have legal and reputational incentives to enforce safety protocols. A $10,000 client is in a different relationship, with different expectations and different leverage on both sides. The details of May 19th, 2012 are reconstructed from the accounts of Sherpas who were on the mountain that day, expedition logs, and the Nepal Mountaineering Association investigation. Shreya left Camp 4, the South Col, at roughly 26,000 feet, in the early hours of the morning, as is standard for summit attempts on the south side. The climb from Camp 4 to the summit covers approximately 3,000 vertical feet of technically demanding terrain. The balcony at 27,600 feet. The south summit at 28,700 feet. The knife edge ridge to the Hillary Step, and the final slope to the top. In good conditions, with a well-acclimatized and well-prepared climber, the ascent takes between 6 and 10 hours. Shreya's ascent took significantly longer. Multiple accounts place her progress as slow relative to other climbers on the route that day. Slowness at extreme altitude is not unusual, and is not by itself dangerous. What it does is compress the margin. Every additional hour on the ascent is an additional hour of oxygen consumption, an additional hour of energy expenditure, an additional hour subtracted from the time available for a safe descent before darkness and cold make the route lethal. She reached the south summit, the false summit at 28,700 feet, roughly an hour below the true top, in the early afternoon. The south summit is the last practical turnaround point before the Hillary Step and the final ridge. A climber who continues past it in deteriorating time or condition has committed to a descent that will be slower and more demanding than the ascent. She continued. She reached the summit at approximately 2:30 p.m. She spent time at the top, time she could not afford to spend. Though at that moment, after 16 hours of climbing, it is not difficult to understand why she stayed. The photographs exist. She's smiling. She's holding a Canadian flag. She's at the top of the world. The descent began, and almost immediately, things went wrong. Her oxygen ran critically low on the upper mountain. Without supplemental oxygen, a climber at 28,000 feet is operating in conditions that impair judgment, coordination, and physical function in ways that are rapid and not always perceptible to the person experiencing them. The hypoxia that sets in above 8,000 meters does not feel like incapacitation. It feels like exhaustion, then confusion, then a narrowing of the world to the immediate moment, and then nothing. The Sherpas with her attempted to assist her descent. They stayed with her on the upper mountain as conditions deteriorated and night came. At some point, she was no longer able to move under her own power. She lost consciousness at approximately 27,700 feet. Less than 300 meters below the summit she had reached 3 hours earlier. She was 33 years old. She had been on the mountain for more than 20 hours. If this kind of storytelling, honest without a clean villain or a clean ending, is what brought you here, subscribe. We cover these mountains the way they deserve to be covered. There are more stories on this channel. We'll keep telling them. The people who were with Shreya Shah Chlorfine when she died were her Sherpa guides. They had been on the mountain as long as she had. They had made the same ascent in the same conditions, carrying their own loads in addition to the oxygen and equipment her expedition required. When her descent stalled on the upper mountain, they stayed. They did not leave. They attempted to keep her moving, to get her low enough that her body might begin to recover the function that altitude was stripping from it. They could not save her. At those altitudes, with the oxygen situation she was in, there was a point past which no amount of Sherpa presence and skill could change the outcome. But they stayed until that point, and beyond it, in conditions that were also dangerous for them. This is not exceptional. This is what Sherpa guides do. Their names do not appear in most of the coverage of her death. The coverage focuses on Shreya, on her story, her ambition, her preparation, the decisions made on summit day, the question of operator responsibility, the men who stayed with her through the night on the upper mountain, who risked their own lives in an attempt to bring her down, who failed not because of anything they did wrong, but because the mountain had already made its decision. Those men are background. They are part of the infrastructure of the story, not the story itself. The investigation records do not make their names easy to find. That difficulty is itself a data point about whose story Everest is considered to be. The Nepal Mountaineering Association conducted an investigation into the circumstances of Shreya Shah Chlorfine's death. The investigation found that Utmost Adventure Trekking had sent an inadequately prepared client onto the upper mountain without sufficient support or oversight. The operator's license was suspended. It was later reinstated. The investigation also raised questions about the broader system. The permit process that did not require proof of experience. The market dynamics that rewarded cheap operators with clients who could not afford more expensive expeditions. The absence of any enforced minimum standard for what a commercial Everest operator was required to provide. Those systemic questions were acknowledged. They were not resolved. They are still not resolved. In the years since 2012, the Nepal Mountaineering Association has periodically discussed introducing experience requirements for Everest permit applicants. A minimum climbing resume demonstrating readiness for the route. Those discussions have not produced enforceable requirements. The permit process remains largely open to anyone who can pay the fee. Shreya's death was not the first attributable to the combination of inadequate preparation and insufficient operator oversight. It was not the last. In the 2012 season alone, multiple deaths on the upper mountain were linked to the same cluster of factors. Late summit times, oxygen exhaustion on the descent, clients whose preparation was not commensurate with the route's demands. That season produced a record 547 summits and a significant number of deaths. The record summits generated celebration. The deaths generated investigations. The investigations generated recommendations. The recommendations were mostly not implemented. The following season, the permits were issued again. The coverage of her death divided, as coverage of Everest deaths usually divides, into two positions. The first held that she made her own choices, that Everest is a dangerous mountain that adults have the right to attempt if they accept the risks, and that assigning blame to the operator or the system is a form of paternalism the mountaineering community should resist. This position has merit. Shreya was an adult. She knew Everest was dangerous. She chose to attempt it. The second held that the commercial system around her created conditions in which the risks she was accepting were not the risks she understood herself to be accepting. That the operator sold her an expedition without adequate disclosure of what her preparation level meant for her actual probability of survival. That the absence of experienced oversight on summit day reflected a failure of the system rather than solely a failure of the individual. Both positions are correct simultaneously. This is the discomfort this story, and every story in this series, eventually arrives at. Shreya made choices. The system made it easier for those choices to lead to her death than it should have been. The operator sold her something she could not safely use. The permit process asked no questions that would have surfaced the mismatch. The question the coverage mostly did not ask, because it is the hardest question with the most uncomfortable answer, is this: if Shreya Shah Chlorfine had paid $65,000 for her Everest expedition instead of $10,000, would she be alive? The honest answer is probably not. Because the core problem was not the operator's budget. It was the gap between her preparation and the mountain's requirements. A more expensive expedition would have provided better oversight, more experienced guides, more active intervention on summit day. It might have turned her around at the south summit, it might have managed her oxygen more carefully, or it might not have. Because at a certain point, above a certain altitude, with a certain combination of exhaustion and hypoxia, and the weight of everything she had invested in the summit, the gap between what she had and what the mountain required may have been too wide for any operator, at any price point, to bridge. This channel has now told 4 stories, and they are all the same story. In 2013, a confrontation at Camp 2 between 3 European climbers and 100 Sherpas ended in rocks and threats, and one woman standing between the violence and something worse. The story was about disrespect and accumulated grievance, and the gap between how Sherpas were treated and how they deserved to be treated. In 2014, 16 Sherpas died in the Khumbu icefall before dawn, carrying loads for clients who were still asleep. And their colleagues decided for the first time in history that they would not continue working under those conditions. The story was about labor and risk and the difference between what Sherpa lives were worth and what they were paid. Between those stories, the commercial luxury market for Everest expeditions grew into a multi-million-dollar industry, selling the summit of the world's highest mountain as a premium product. Helicopters and heated tents and private chefs at base camp, while the Sherpas who made that product possible continued to earn a fraction of what it was sold for. And in 2012, a woman from Canada stood on top of the world at 2:30 in the afternoon, after 16 hours of climbing, with not enough oxygen to get back down. And the Sherpas who stayed with her through the night could not save her. These are not separate stories. They are four angles on the same mountain, the same industry, the same structural reality that has been in place since the first European expedition hired the first Sherpa porter in the 1920s and has not been fundamentally changed by anything that has happened since. The mountain is still open. The permits are still being issued. The Sherpas are still going in before dawn. And every season, somewhere on the upper mountain, the gap between what someone paid for and what the mountain requires becomes, for someone, too wide to survive. Her body remained on the upper mountain for several days after her death. It was eventually recovered by a team of Sherpas, men who made an additional ascent into the death zone at significant personal risk, to bring her down. They did this because her family wanted her home. They did this because it is what Sherpas do, and have always done, and will continue to do as long as people keep coming to the mountain with dreams that the mountain is not obligated to honor. She was brought to base camp. She was flown to Kathmandu. She was returned to Canada. Her husband spoke publicly about her death in the months that followed. He did not speak with bitterness. He spoke with grief and with a determination that her story not be reduced to a cautionary tale about a woman who wanted too much and paid for it. He wanted people to understand that she was more than her death, that she was a person who had built something real in her life, who had loved her family, who had pursued her goal with everything she had. He was right. She was more than her death. She was also a person whose death tells us something true and important about a system that is still operating, still selling permits, still sending people onto the upper mountain with gaps between their preparation and the mountain's requirements that no amount of money or ambition can close. The summit is not the end of the story. It never was. The summit is the halfway point. What matters, what has always mattered, what the commercial industry has never quite found a way to communicate to the people paying for the dream, is the descent. Getting up is optional. Getting down is mandatory. Shreya Shaklor Fine got up. She stood at the top of the world. She took her photographs. She began to come down. The mountain did not let her finish.